All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the discussion chapter, which is typically chapter 5, but not always. The discussion chapter has several parts, and as we go along, you guys are welcome to type into the chat. We'll get back to you either immediately, or if it's something that needs a follow-up, send you a follow-up email to provide responses to your questions. And then if the questions are really specific to you, or maybe the questions apply to everyone else, we'll take a minute and go over your question and let everyone else take a look at what your questions are and see how those questions could help them maybe get over some hurdles they're facing. So the discussion chapter is typically made up of these different sections. So you have the introduction to the chapter. You have a section where you reiterate the results with clear support or non-support for your hypotheses when it is a quantitative study. You provide information about whether or not the results fit the existing literature or if this is some sort of a new finding. You talk about the implications of the results for theory and practice, the limitations of the study, the recommendations for the future research, and oftentimes you have a conclusion section as well. So we will spend some time to go over each of these sections. If you have questions as we go, please type them in, and like I said, we'll get you an answer either today or through email over the next couple days. So the introduction paragraph, and I do have here that it's typically less than a page in length. As I was going over these slides, initially I tried to include information about how long each of these different sections are, but ultimately I wound up taking that information out because it does vary depending upon your particular research, how many questions you had, what your findings were, whether it was quantitative or qualitative. So there are really a lot of different things that go into the length of these sections. So I think, the takeaway from that is don't focus on the length, focus on covering the materials and providing the information that you need. But the length of the introduction paragraph is typically less than a page in length. It's a pretty standard paragraph. So the discussion chapter is really the bookend to your dissertation. You're tying everything together with this piece. You pull from the literature, you talk about the problem, the purpose, a bit about the methodology, and you represent the results. And you want to put it all together in this one chapter and make sure that like I said, it ties everything together. So in your introduction paragraph, you use language similar to what was used in your introduction chapter, and you want to summarize the problem and the purpose statement that you presented. In the introduction paragraph, your other goal is to let the reader know what information will be presented in that chapter so they know what to expect next, what information is coming. All right, after the introduction, you have this summary of the findings. So you're going to report the findings in your own words. In this case, the writing should be scholarly but not overly technical. So what you want to do is maybe think about how you would describe your study findings to an interested colleague or family member, but do keep it professional. Be sure to report the results of each of the hypotheses tests or each of the research questions. So it could be the themes, it could be the statistical analyses. And then the length does vary, like I said, depending on the number of hypotheses that are presented for the study. once you've presented the summary of the findings, you want to present the interpretation of those findings. The interpretation of the findings is the core of the discussion chapter. For quantitative, and you want to consider the organization, so for quantitative studies, you organize the interpretation around the hypotheses or the research questions, whereas for qualitative studies, you'll organize the information around the identified themes that answer each of those research questions. One of the things that you want to do in the interpretation of the findings section is to focus on whether your results confirm or don't confirm the findings from previous studies that were mentioned in your literature. A thing to keep in mind is that once you're in the discussion chapter, you typically don't bring in new literature, but sometimes it may become necessary to do so if the chapter 2 winds up being a little bit off target, or maybe not heavy enough, you didn't have enough information there to provide that material for chapter 5. And then additionally, sometimes your chair may just ask for you to add more information and pull some more articles that help to support what your findings were. So, like I said, typically you're not adding more research. You want to pull in what you have from the literature review, but in some cases it is necessary. In those cases, you may want to consult with your chair and find out what their thoughts are on it if you're really struggling with pulling the information that you have into the chapter. All right, another slide on interpretation of the findings. For each question or theme, you want to review the major findings from previous studies presented in the literature review. So tie them back to those studies, talk about how they were similar, talk about how they were different, and elaborate on that information that's presented. A lot of times also in quantitative studies, you'll find that you don't have significance. That doesn't mean your study was for nothing. If you would have started out and you would have known that there wasn't going to be significance, it wouldn't have been a study that had to be conducted. But because you don't know, it still makes it worth it to run the analyses, find out that it's not significant, and it's still important. When you don't have significance, there are a few things to consider. It's possible that you had methodological weakness. Non-significant findings can also indicate that an intervention is not effective, or a variable, construct, or instrument was not appropriate for the study. It also could have been due to a small sample size, or maybe there just wasn't significance to be found in that instance. And like I said, it doesn't discount your study. It doesn't mean your study is not worth anything. It means that your study was done, you followed the methodology you set out to, and you showed that there was not significance. Does anyone have questions about any of this so far? It looks like some people are having a hard time hearing. Can you guys hear me okay? Everyone? Anyone? Okay. All right. Well, I will continue on. All right. So you have the implications for practice. Well, you have implications is the next section. You have implications for practice, implications for research, and then implications for social change, which happens to be just specifically for Walden. The implications for practice tie back to practitioners or people working in the field. So what are the implications of your findings as it relates to these people in this population? How does it affect them? The implications for research are in regards to how researchers approach the topic. And then implications for social change, like I said, is just specific to Walden. And then what do your findings mean for general society? With the implications for social change, what you want to think about is, why is this important? How do my findings apply to the real world? And what are some things that could potentially happen because of this new information? Things like that are the root of your implications. And by discussing the importance of your findings within a real world context instead of the theoretical or gap in the literature, you're demonstrating the social significance of the study. So you want to dig a little deeper, pull this information in, elaborate on this information, because you've presented your findings. You've talked about those findings, how it ties back to the literature, but what are the implications of those findings? How does it relate to the people that matter most in these fields? Any questions about implications? All right, it doesn't look like it. Limitations of the study. The limitations are broken down here into quantitative and qualitative limitations. So under the quantitative limitations, we have generalizability and reliability and validity. Generalizability is an extension of the research finding and conclusions from a study conducted on a sample population to the population at large. So consider your sample of participants and how are the findings from your study on your sample related to a larger population. The reason this applies to quantitative and not to qualitative is in qualitative research, you really aren't looking for generalizability. Your sample size is typically smaller and you're focused just on your specific population, and that is what interests you, not generalizing to the larger population. Let's see, reliability and validity, those tie back to your survey instruments where they found to be reliable and valid. And again, that ties specifically to quantitative. When it comes to qualitative, you want to consider trustworthiness. And trustworthiness is really composed of these 4 different components. Those components are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And let me know if you want me to slow down or repeat anything here. I do want to go over each of these. So credibility is the confidence in the study's findings. Transferability is demonstrating that the findings are applicable to other contexts. Dependability is the extent to which the research can be duplicated. And then finally, confirmability is the degree of neutrality. So just to say that the study was conducted not based upon the researchers' biases, but on neutrality. Any questions about any of those pieces, the limitations, quantitative or qualitative? All right, it looks like everyone's good there. Again, if you have questions, feel free to write them in. We will get back to you and get some answers for you. Recommendations for future research. So Here you want to think a little bit about what would you do if you had all the time, money, and energy in the world, but limit it to your study, not just I'm going to go out and I'm going to pay people $1,000 to participate in my study and they're going to give me the best answers and it's going to be so great. Focus on your study. Make sure that your recommendations for future research come from your findings or your specific study limitations. So did you have limits on the people you could reach? Maybe you wanted to look at an older population, but you did an internet survey, and so some of them didn't have access to the computers. That would be a study limitation. And how would you, in the future, better communicate or better reach an elderly population to conduct the research, to get the sample that you're really looking for, and to make sure that everyone has a fair chance at participating and responding. So consider different samples, variables, and controls. Different samples, maybe different ethnicities, different age groups, people from different regions could provide different answers. Different variables, of course, are always a factor. I know if you think back to when you were studying or setting up your study and thinking even in your early stages, maybe your prospectus, your concept paper, your SMR, your introduction paragraph, what variables were important, what did you want to look at, and maybe consider some of the things that you thought about but wound up not using. How could things have been different? And then controls, maybe you found significance, but think significance could have been attributed to different areas. Maybe you found significance, but that could have been attributed to gender. So consider going out and looking again, and this time controlling for gender so that it doesn't have an effect or a factor influence on the results of your study. Also consider different methodologies and study design. So if you did qualitative research, maybe you had some significant findings where you're ready to step out and say, I think a quantitative study could be performed here. Or maybe you did a quantitative study, but you want to learn more information or get more in-depth information, so you could suggest a qualitative study. You could look at a longitudinal study, so a study over time. You could look at a case study. So you have, it's really so many options of things you did differently. So think about what your options are, but make sure that they tie back to your study, they make sense for your study and for the findings that you have. And so some schools do end with the recommendations for future research. Some also ask for a concluding paragraph or conclusion paragraph. Like I said, it's specific to the school, so it just depends. The conclusion is really, it's the take-home message about the most important aspects of your study or what you really want people to remember. So put it together in a paragraph, tie everything together, and you have your discussion chapter. Does anyone have questions about anything that we've gone over? If you guys do, I don't know, maybe you're working on your discussion chapter right now, you're about to sit down and put something on the page, and maybe you get stuck, you can always reach out to us, info@statisticsolutions.com, or you can visit our website and send some questions over. So we have a question about confirmability. How do you prove that you're neutral in the study? And so I think that this is something that you're really handling this all along. It should have been something that went into your methodology chapter. A lot of times with the qualitative study, you are the researcher, you are the interviewer, you are the analyzer, you're the interpreter. And a lot of the research that you wind up getting into is because you have some sort of outside interest in that, and that's why you started down this path. So as you go along, you need to take every step possible to make sure that you're not introducing your biases. So I know you read and reread and read and reread and do that 20 1,000 times over while you're writing this, but maybe do it a couple times just specifically looking for biases, where you would say, oh, wow, that's my voice influencing this, and I shouldn't have that in there. And do that process through every chapter to make sure that you're not inserting your biases. You know, it really is, it's up to you to look at it through a neutral lens. And then also, your chair is going to go in and look at it afterwards, and I'm sure that if that is something that they're seeing, they'll point that out to you as well, and you'll make those revisions and know how to get it to where it needs to be for resubmission so that you can get that through. But it's a process that has to happen throughout the entire dissertation, and just be aware of what your biases are and watch for them as you're writing and going back and reviewing what you've presented. Thank you very much for attending today. We hope to see you in the future at one of our upcoming webinars. Everyone, take care.